Kendav Balan Tukai. Finally, warriors worthy of combat walk before me. I was beginning to think your champions were all cowards, Kaisar. Varuki Togat Ronga Dobaki. This one surprises me with its Doba source. I have heard rumors. Maybe you are worthy of my Norak Mir gold. It has been a grave for lesser mortals. In your tongue, they call it Wyrmstooth. To the door, it is the Brumlock Strunma. Seek it, Ya goes Walan, and you shall have the battle you seek.
Wyrmstooth is a campaign for Skyrim released a while back, and basically about a year ago the author removed it off the face of the internet, so it's basically nowhere to be found on the Skyrim websites, at least the major ones. And I actually found this out recently because I'm not in touch with the Skyrim community, or any community for that matter, since I'm a recluse when it comes to online modding communities. So I only found this out just recently when I was perusing through Skyrim mods. And I wanted to do a walkthrough on this because I've always maintained that Wyrmstooth, for the greater portion of its design and makeup as a campaign, is actually better than Falskar, which seems to be the professed premier campaign for Skyrim. As I'll explain throughout, it's evident to me that Falskar isn't, in layman's terms, the best campaign for Skyrim, and that it's more suitable for Wyrmstooth to at least challenge the claim to that title by other mods like Falskar. But this will mostly be a critical review of Wyrmstooth and my own investigation later on into why this is not exactly discerned. I'll be skipping through some of the dialogue that isn't important, and some of the parts that are easily completed to save time. In particular, the beginning of the campaign is pretty straightforward. What you do is you have to find 4 different people at various locations in Skyrim, and the quest indicators are given, so it's self-evident where you need to go to complete that portion of the quest. In respect to that particular gameplay decision, to have the player collect the secondary characters around Skyrim, I would say that the way that was done was somewhat sloppy in that you merely had to click a few times to complete the portion of the quest, and it's not evident to me that the portion of time in which you're doing this is used well, since it doesn't really produce anything novel or entertaining, and it almost felt like a World of Warcraft style quest experience. So essentially what I'm saying is you go to a quest giver and they want you to get various items from various locations and come back, and it doesn't really do anything except build up your experience. That's basically the template for a World of Warcraft quest, at least back in the vanilla era. And certainly it could have been thought through differently and better, and the primary reasoning that I can discern seems to be that the storyline needed a way to gather the characters individually, but there are various other possibilities that could have been considered. So all in all, it's obviously not too big of a deal, but it's sort of a rough start simultaneously. So basically you start off on the island of Wyrmstooth, which is located around northwest Skyrim. And I'd like to comment on the exterior here. The exterior design, although we're not going to cover it so much here, but the climate reflects Skyrim's northern and central portions for the most part. Naturally so, since it's near Solitude. But immediately once you enter, you don't feel that there's an environmental transition once you leave Skyrim. When you first lay your eyes on Wyrmstooth, you don't feel the immersion breaking apart due to distinctions in the design of the environment, and you shouldn't. The island is off the coast of Solitude, so you should feel as though you're still in Skyrim's region. Imagine if instead you arrived at an island with a sparse forest and a plain look. At that point, you'll be thinking in your head, okay, I just left Skyrim and I'm in someone else's creation. Oh hey, this is not actually part of Skyrim, it's just a mod, and all the immersion just fell apart because of bad exterior design. Look at the poorly made landscape or the strangely created forests. There are a few things I want to underscore here in particular. Firstly, the outside world transitions from biome to biome quite smoothly. So if you stroll through Wyrmstooth, you don't realize that you've gone through from a lush green forest to a snowy mountainous region. The transition is natural, which really shows how well the author crafted biome regions. At the same time, the visuals are rich with a display of natural decor that is thoughtfully placed so as to reflect the natural world, but also distinguish places of interest so that it's still interesting and not plain as you go through it. The audio is just as rich as you stroll through, and you can hear that when I go through the nature in Wyrmstooth for the most part, everything sort of comes together into an experience of immersion. One useful way to determine whether a level designer has done their job in terms of sound is to close your eyes or extract the audio from a recording, then try to imagine the world around you. If it's too plain or clunky or ambiguous, or even worse if it's just silent, including music, then you'll know it's not very well designed. In contrast, if it isn't, you'll at least know that the designer has created a world solely by the use of sound, so it's certainly sufficient, and afterwards you can pick at the details and see how convincing it is. Wyrmstooth certainly does its job and evidently aims for a quiet and solemn ambience in most regions. Now, I want to talk about a couple things before I move into looking at Wyrmstooth Barrow. Firstly, I've noticed in reviews of Skyrim campaigns that levels and quests that meet the baseline of sufficiency are sort of praised as outstanding products of excellence, which I don't think is appropriate. We don't do that with anything else where it counts. So, for instance, if a level meets the minimum factors in order to be entertaining, it doesn't mean that it's a good mod. It only means that it's not poorly developed. I mean, as a thought experiment here, let's say that you're talking about food, and the baseline is shit. Like, most of the cases you encounter are total shit, literal feces. And then you're given an entree that tastes only a little bit like shit. You don't then proceed to say that it's an excellent dish. We don't do this for industry-driven products. If the voice acting in Skyrim, for example, was half-assed, but everywhere else it either didn't exist or it's totally wonky, people wouldn't be saying, well, at least they tried. That's not an acceptable response on an industry level. People would probably be saying something like, can we please get a game where the voice acting isn't batshit off-the-wall quality? So if a mod is normal, that is to say that you were mildly entertained by it, but most others are terrible. You shouldn't conclude that it's amazing. Perhaps, by definition, it's outstanding from a statistical perspective, if you were to quantify levels of quality. But that doesn't merit critical praise or an award, not by any standard which actually seeks to distinguish exceptional from normal mods and campaigns, as it were. And certainly not by those same standards which try to focus more on quality, sheer quality, instead of making distinctions among a population statistically to say that one is outstanding solely because it's not normal. The second thing is the rubric. Skyrim and Creation Engine games and other games like it have a mesh placement system to perform the majority of level design. Compare that with traditional methods like BSP mapping, or methods where the level designer has complete responsibility and control of visual geometry. The important thing to note is that when you look at the vast majority of cases in Skyrim, you're looking at someone else's architecture sets. And I extract two different conclusions from this. Number one is that you cannot then say the architecture in this level is well designed when you have a simple Dwemer hallway, for instance, because all the mapper did was click a couple times to make that. It's not theirs. So you can't grade or credit them for something that isn't theirs. Secondly, you have to look at Skyrim mapping from a different perspective. For quantization purposes, I make two distinctions in architecture as a geometric art. The first is structure and the second is innovation. If the structure doesn't make sense, that is to say it's not orderly on some level, it's not well developed. And if it's too plain, it's not well developed either, because it means that you can't distinguish it from a random room. Now, in reference to solely structure, it's a little bit more difficult to grasp, but basically, if I threw a monkey in a room with two paint cans, and I came back an hour later, and the walls would be covered in splatters of paint and shit, that's not art. Now, you can go for the postmodernist perspective and say it is art because everything is art, and sort of pretend like that's the case, in which you're inadvertently leveling the hierarchies of categorization of all kinds of art to one level, at which point you can't really distinguish one art piece from another, and literal shit becomes equivalent to the Mona Lisa or the Sistine Chapel or something like that. And you can pretend like that's art, and a lot of definitions and categorizations completely fall apart in that case, so it becomes sort of useless. Yeah, that's a discussion for another time, but the point being that we look at structure that is humanly beautiful, which is kind of complex, but I think it's sufficient to say in summary that it's sort of driven to some degree by biology, and that when people look at certain things, we can say that something is more beautiful than something else, and that to some degree is driven by the structure of the world, and partially by the Darwinian path that organisms take, although that's again a discussion for another time. Point being that's an important aspect to architecture. There's an idea floating about that basically says if you apply more constraints on art, it provides for more creativity. And the idea is that if you have two people with two different canvases, you tell one, make anything you want, and you tell another, you have to make things that are only with squares, let's say. It's a lot easier to make something creative if you have everything to choose from. It's a lot harder to do that with constraints. So if the artist with the square constraint makes something even more creative than the artist with everything to choose from, and you do that various times with the same person, you'll certainly know that the artist has demonstrated their creative capacity and skill. The same is the case for Skyrim. How do you make something creative with things that are already made for you? Exactly. That's one metric to distinguish between the artistic depth of different levels. At the same time, I do recognize a baseline and minima. If the map is well developed by Skyrim standards, in other words, it's well designed enough to put into Skyrim without anyone noticing. It is on a visual level sufficiently well developed. So the following is a rubric a bit distinct from the one I use for BSP oriented maps or game engines, let's say. Entering Wyrmstooth Barrow, we're greeted with the typical Nordic dungeon. Throughout the level, the structure is pretty standard in that it reflects Skyrim's Nordic dungeons. And as you'll see, the different areas of the map sort of blend well together as you transition through hallways and doors. There isn't anything particularly special about it, but it's evident that it's well developed, given that no room looks out of place or visually dissonant solely in terms of the meshes. In the larger rooms where there are more opportunities for architecture to vary, the author makes clear attempts to provide some architectural structure, sometimes through the presentation of symmetric structures, and other times by detailing spaces where there would normally be plain walls or floors. Overall, it's standard and the rooms certainly aren't plain, so it sort of makes the cut without going any further. The atmosphere, on the other hand, is far more well developed. The stark contrast this strong lighting makes magnifies the grim feel of the crypt, and the visual detailing spares no plain areas, so everything is visually rich. That, along with the visual effects, provides an immersive experience. The same goes for the sounds. You get a feel of an eerie crypt as the ghostly wind howls about you as you stumble through the hallways of the burrow. There are a few interesting scenes and events with characters in the beginning of the map. The obvious one that stood out was the interaction with the senile mage, and it certainly was a surprise to see the scenario where you had to control the Draugr in order to open the gate. So these unique interactions get the player's attention because it's not what you're expecting when you go through a typical dungeon in Skyrim. It was actually a little short-lived, but it's still worth mentioning. The combat intensity is worth noting because it's a challenge, and it's challenging enough that even if your character is high level and well geared, there is still enough of a challenge in the form of leveled enemies to keep you occupied, so it does its job overall. The main issue here is that the map flows way too much, so basically you can skip a ton of enemies even if they chase after you, as you'll see in a moment. Putting a bunch of NPCs in a room with no coordination and opening all the exits is a sort of lazy excuse for providing combat scenarios. The rest of them are conventional and make for more than enough to keep the player occupied. The puzzles contribute to the easing of the flow and sort of give stopping points for the player to rest, even though they're kind of easy traditionally to get through, so it doesn't stop it too much, and there were no surprises in terms of puzzles or those kind of interactive events. Now, for new viewers, probably from Skyrim, I want to reintroduce this idea that I think is quite important in level design that comes from the Unreal design community, which is Conceptual Grandness. Now, there are a couple obscure essays that elaborate on this. One can be found in unrealsp.org, I believe, but I'll try to summarize it in a couple of sentences here. Conceptual grandness is basically a metric on the visual and representative impression a level has on the player, and it in particular seeks to establish how breathtaking the visuals of a map are and how awesome the concept behind it is. Awesome in the very literal and definitive sense of the word. The latter is a bit more difficult to grasp. Let me try to give you an example. Imagine this in your head, and try your best not to add your own details to it. Imagine a tower on an island. Now, imagine a colossal sand-colored tower so tall that it touches the clouds, and it's on a small island surrounded on all sides by the ocean with a sunset painting it, connected with a bridge to a towering keep. So why does the second example feel bigger or grander? And even while trying to balance out the details of both examples. Let me give you a visual example. Now basically, these two things are towers, roughly speaking. They're the same concept. So why is one more breathtaking? This is basically what conceptual grandness is. You can fulfill it in one of two ways. Either make a grand concept, or take a typical concept like a tower and make it grand. Now, it definitely correlates somewhat with physical size, but not exactly. If you make a gigantic cube and say that's a tower, for example, it wouldn't be conceptually grand at all. So it's not the same thing as size exactly. And I can point to a few levels that are small in terms of what the player navigates, yet maintain conceptual grandness. Here's an easy test to determine how conceptually grand something is. If you can think of the concept of what the level is in itself, and that very concept is awing and memorable, it's probably conceptually grand. Now remember, the concept and not the exact visuals are what we're after here. So this level in particular doesn't do much to emphasize conceptual grandness at all. In other words, if you were just given the level and you didn't know how it looked outside, you wouldn't really have a feel of a sense of place, a sense of where you're walking through. Now, you are given that outside world that inadvertently contributes to it perhaps, but we're looking at solely the interior, or what that portion of the map is. Indeed, it's on a mountain, a snowy mountain, in basically the middle of the mountains. But there's nothing inside that can convey that feel of where you're at, of grandness. On the other hand, the visual eye is satisfied enough so as to keep things entertaining from a purely visual context, but does nothing outside of the ordinary. And there's nothing particularly novel here in terms of visual effects or innovations that haven't been done in Skyrim. So it definitely meets the mark of sufficiency, but it doesn't really go beyond that. The level does nothing in particular to advance the storyline and contributes little to character development. It's sort of an adventurous level. There were certainly opportunities to develop the characters and the storyline overall, but it's rather simple storyline to begin with. It at least maintains a proper conception. I mean, it does provide a villain and the motivation, and the basic idea is that the Dragonborn is stopping the dragon for obvious reasons. He wants to take over the world, essentially. So if you abstract from this, it's sort of like the traditional powerful villain versus savior kind of thing, but plays out in a simplistic way. However, at least it does have structure, at least it is logical. It goes from one set of events to another that can be followed, can be tracked into a logical sequence. Now, in contrast to other campaigns in other games like Half-Life and Unreal Tournament, the storyline generally really matters when it comes to Skyrim. It's basically the motivator for all the portions of the game, as far as I know. So if there's a campaign, you would expect that essential, that aspect to this game would bleed into campaigns for Skyrim, or at least that the authors would attempt to allow that. Wyrmstooth's storyline is actually pretty conventional, although I don't really know if there are cliches for Skyrim. Like, for example, in Unreal, the storyline cliche was your ship crash lands on Holly and then blah blah blah. I don't know if the cliche in Skyrim campaigns is a dragon comes and then stuff happens. But in any case, the storyline in Wyrmstooth is at least well developed, as I've said before. I also want to make an emphasis on the technical execution and the motivation for this is the same argument, which is basically to reward quality. One of my pet peeves, and probably the mundane annoyance to most Skyrim players, the download campaigns, is the amazingly dissonant and fluctuating quality of voice acting seen between mods and inside them. If you can't produce quality voice acting, don't rape the player's ears by doing it anyway. The other issue is a bit more subtle, but it's basically the variation of quality of sound among different voices. Different voice actors in Skyrim modding use different mics, and some people's mics and productive capacity are apparently far worse than others. So you end up with a mod where one character will be moderately well voiced or excellent, right next to another character who sounds like they're being voiced from the inside of an oil drum. So the technical issues won't be factored into the level design rubric, but will be considered in the overall grading scheme. With Wyrmstooth, the voice acting falls victim to the second widespread issue. So if you have the campaign, you'll notice that Glorious Lore kind of sounds like he's talking from an open bathroom. And if you're keen enough, you'll notice that there's a fuzziness in the voice acting for Elmera. I understand that it's very difficult to find skilled voice actors that simultaneously have good audio setups, but I have seen enough examples of at least decent voice acting to know that they are not too rare for this issue to be skimmed over by every designer.